make a couple of quick announcements. Do you guys want me to play Corinne and Cheyenne some Mavis Staples?
That'd be good. Thank you.
I'm going to play some Mavis Staples, and then I'm going to make a couple of announcements, and then we have some guest lecturers. That's very exciting.
Corinne and all them, I'll make you. I'm trying to think.
Yeah, you just, yeah.
We shall not be moved. We shall not be moved like a tree that's planted by the water. We shall be moved. We shall not be moved. We shall not be moved like a tree that's planted by the water. We shall not be moved. Union is behind us. We shall not be moved. The union is behind us. We shall not be moved. Just like a tree that's planted by the water. We shall not be moved. We're fighting for our freedom. We shall not be moved. Fighting for our freedom. We shall not be like a tree that's planted by the water. We shall not be moved. Fighting for our children. We shall not be moved. We're fighting for our children. We shall not be moved like a tree that's planted by the water. We shall not be moved. Black and white together, we shall not be moved. Black and white together, we shall not be just like a tree that's planted by the water. We shall not be. We shall not be moved. We shall not be just like a tree that's planted by the water. We shall not be moved. Well, now we shall not be moved. Oh, we shall not be just like a tree that's planted by the water. We shall not be moved. Oh, we shall not be moved. We shall not be moved like a tree that's planted by the water. water. We shall not be moved.
Okay, guys. So a couple of quick announcements. All right. One is that the College of Arts and Sciences has made it clear that I cannot make a due date on Friday due to the instructional holiday. So I ran it by them and they said it was fine that it was due Thursday at midnight. I did not want to do that to you, however, who were planning on doing it on Friday. So it is due on Thursday and it is open until Friday at midnight. It is open from 6 a.m. on Thursday until midnight on Friday. So for those of you who will be grading, Eric, Corinne, Cheyenne, Edward, it may say late, don't worry about it as long as they got it in. No consequences, no consequences, no consequences. Okay. So as a reminder, I sent you an email that told you all about this exam. It gave you some prompts. It told you that, you know, you need to write in full essay form. So intro, body, conclusion, that's academic writing. That's part of what we teach you is how to communicate. And so do so on this exam. All right. You have no labs on Friday. However, those were already canceled. We already knew that wasn't happening. So there are no labs. Okay. Answer the question, right? I mean, answer all the parts of the question. Somewhere between 250. There's not a workbook due on Friday. Remember, I sent you a new syllabus, guys. Yes. Okay. If it is due, then we'll fix it, right? So I don't think that there's one due. All right. So those are my announcements. Now my next announcement is a exciting introduction of Cheyenne Black and Corinne Anslem to say, hey, this is what's gone on since 1970 in terms of civil rights. Thanks, guys.
Okay. Oh, so we can't share. Can you turn it on so we can share the screen? Dr. Rowlett. Oh, cool.
Try now. It should work.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm Corinne. I'm Cheyenne. We're currently in the bullpen in the political science department, so that's why we have our masks on. But we're going to talk to you today about some modern civil rights movements that are going on in the US. And I thought a good place to start would be with the Black Panthers. Yes, this isn't like totally current, but I feel like it is an important part of the modern civil rights movement. So the Black Panthers were founded after the assassination of Malcolm X and after the police killing of an unarmed teen, Matthew Johnson, in Los Angeles. It was started by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, who were disappointed in the failure of the civil rights movement to improve conditions for Black people, specifically outside of the South. They deemed the brutality they saw against civil rights protesters as kind of a continuous occurrence of police violence and state oppression. So thus the title was originally the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. Their early causes were kind of just to monitor police activity in Black communities, but they were part of a larger Black Power movement of the time. Again, this is in 1966, that had an emphasis on Black pride, community control, and the unification of civil rights, for civil rights. The leadership of the Black Panther Party also kind of viewed the Black Panther Party as a political party with the goal of electing more Black Americans to office. And they also notably started community social programs, some of which are still kind of like around today and have influenced other community programs that we think of, specifically like the free breakfast program for school kids and free health clinics. Oops. Oh. Okay. And so in 1969, the Black Panther Party was actually declared a communist organization and an enemy of the US government by J. Edgar Hoover, who was head of the FBI at the time. During this time, the party was kind of riddled with police informants and FBI informants, which was actually what would later be coined as COINTELPRO. It was kind of like a very strategic and deliberate undermining of the Black Panther Party. And then a lot of the key party leaders were also arrested, including Huey Newton, one of the creators of the party, in 1967. And all of this would kind of like eventually lead to a lot of factioning within the party. And the party officially ended in 1982. Okay. And I think an important part of talking about, especially like Black political movements in the US, is talking about the war on drugs. During the early 1980s into the 1990s, the US implemented the war on drugs and tough on crime policy initiatives that had a direct impact on what we now think of as mass incarceration, but also a really key impact on Black community activism and organizing that was currently going on. And because of like the racialized aspects of the laws, namely the sentencing disparity between crack cocaine and powdered cocaine, Black communities around the country saw millions of people disappeared into state and federal prisons and increases in police activity in their communities. And this kind of left a vacuum in the US for Black community activism and organization that Cheyenne's going to talk about a little bit at the end of our presentation. Okay, now we have a short video.
A lot of what's been achieved in regards to LGBTQ rights today goes back decades to one event in particular. 50 years ago in New York City, in the early hours of June 28th, 1969, the Stonewall Riots. In 1969, it was illegal to be gay in New York State and every other state except Illinois. The Stonewall Riots kicked off a revolution that had implications over time across the US, in Canada, and around the world. Mark Siegel is the founder of the Philadelphia Gay News and a veteran gay rights activist. He was at the Stonewall that night. He was just 18 years old and unknowingly would become part of history just because he happened to be there. Simply going to the bar on any given night was an act of liberation for people like Siegel in those days.
It was, in a sense, a safe place. You could put your arm around someone, you could kiss someone, you could hold hands, you could dance with someone. That was all very important those days because LGBT people were invisible.
Welcome to the Stonewall Inn, tucked away on Christopher Street in New York's Greenwich Village. It didn't really look like much.
I was inside Stonewall, just doing what you normally did, talking to your friends. And all of a sudden, the lights blinked on and off. And they went on. And I said to somebody, "What's going on?" And they said, "Oh, it's a rave," very nonchalantly.
The Stonewall was the frequent target of police raids. It was run by the mob, and like many gay bars that existed in those days, it operated without a license to serve alcohol. So the cops were regular visitors, mostly to collect bribes from the bar and its customers.
I'd never been in something like a raid before. I still looked like the boy next door. So when the cops came in, the only thing they were interested in doing was extorting money from the older guys and pushing the stereotypical people around. People like me were of no use to them. So I was one of the first to be carted and let out of the bar.
Outside, Siegel and others began to form a semicircle in front of the Stonewall's door. As the police made arrests inside, the crowd grew by the dozens and eventually outnumbered the police and employees still left inside the bar.
The employees and the police were trapped in the bar. And then when the police realized this, one of them opened the door and tried to say something like, "Get away from here, you fairies," or something. And someone threw something.
That's how it began, but that's not where it ended. For 3 more nights, they remained defiant and continued to protest, turning a riot into a movement.
From the ashes of Stonewall came Gay Liberation Front. Gay Liberation Front probably is the most important LGBT organization that ever existed. We ended invisibility. We took back our streets. And if all of that weren't enough, we created the world's first gay community center. And then on the first anniversary, we created Gay Pride.
There are different versions of how Stonewall unfolded and why it was that night the patrons fought back.
Judy Garland. Now, it's been 50 years since Judy passed away. And on the night of her funeral, in June 1969, the Stonewall Riots occurred.
Wow, I didn't know that correlation. I didn't know that either.
Fed up with police harassment, the patrons of the Stonewall used their grief over Judy's death to rise up and fight back. And the gay liberation movement was born.
That's not how or why the gay liberation movement was born, but that Judy Garland story has been told time and time again. There's a good reason why it's time to stop that.
There were, in the 1960s, about 100 riots of various types. There were race riots. There were riots because of the Vietnam War, and our riot is included in those 100 riots. One seems to be the only one that was sparked by a songstress. It's belittling us. That's really belittling.
That wasn't the only way this civil rights uprising was belittled. A headline in the tabloid New York Daily News in the days following the riots read like this: "Homo nest raided, queen bees are stinging mad." The author repeatedly describing how the queens lisped their outrage. In 2016, the paper's editorial team aimed to right that wrong. It's important to recognize the role of drag queens and transgender people in the riots and the movement that came after. You can't tell this story without them.
But those who were transvestites, transsexuals, all those terms, they were easy targets, visible targets for the police. And of course, especially for trans people of color, there were very few places to go where they'd be left alone.
Two well-known names on Christopher Street at that time were Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson.
What we've heard is that they were, if not the first, among the very first to start throwing things and fighting back, deciding they had nothing to lose.
The struggle for recognition for transgender people continued after Stonewall, even within the gay community. Some organizations, apart from the Gay Liberation Front, didn't want people like Johnson and Rivera involved.
And there was a lot of hostility towards trans inclusion in Pride for a long, long time. There was this claim that, and still out there in some circles, that trans people are hurting the community, but they were determined, and many others in New York and around the country were inspired by their bravery and their courage.
It's also because of outspoken activists like Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera that some people of color and transgender individuals in the LGBTQ community today sometimes take radical steps when their voices aren't being heard. The Stonewall Riots inspired movements around the world. 50 years later, nearly 30 countries and territories now have marriage equality. More than 100 have anti-discrimination laws on the books, even though there are still challenges in many of those places. At the same time, more than 70 countries still punish homosexuality in some way, and even in countries where hard-fought battles have been won, like the US, where the site of the Stonewall Riots is now a national monument, there are efforts to roll back some of the progress that has been made in the decades since that uprising.
I think people don't know the roots of the first gay pride and don't know its history. I think we've lost that fighting spirit that we had at Stonewall GLF. And I think that's why we're losing in certain areas today.
The triumphs of the LGBTQ rights community should be celebrated, but a celebration for the battles that have been won doesn't mean the fight for rights is over, even 50 years on.
Okay. Okay. So I should have mentioned before that started playing that I was moving into LGBT rights, specifically civil rights. I wanted to play that video because I think there's a lot of talk about like how Stonewall was really the beginning for LGBT rights in the US. But there were actually like several pretty major events that happened even prior to Stonewall. Most notably, the Compton Cafeteria riots. If you've never looked up anything about the Compton Cafeteria riots, I highly recommend it. It was a group of trans women in San Francisco in a place called Jean's Compton Cafeteria, and they were regularly being harassed by the police for being trans. And the riot was kind of sparked because a trans woman threw her coffee in a cop's face, and from there, kind of this whole queer uprising began. And then on the slide, I have a couple of other notable events as far as like advancing LGBT rights in the U.S. and just some of the events that were talked about in the video. So in 1969, we have the Stonewall Riots. In 1966, the Compton Cafeteria Riots happened. And like was mentioned in the video, in 1970, we see the first Pride celebration. It started in New York, but obviously became like the global thing. And so every year during Pride, it's actually a commemoration of what happened at Stonewall as well. And then in 2009, we see an expansion of the 1969 federal hate crime laws to include gender, sexuality, and sexual orientation as a result of the Matthew Shepard murder. Matthew Shepard was a young gay man who was targeted because he was gay and killed. And then in 2015, we see obviously Obergefell v. Hodges. They begin marriage equality for LGBT people in the US. And then in 2020, this past year, we were finally given rights as far as like not being discriminated against at work. So you can't be fired for being gay. However, there's still obviously a long way to go with gay rights in the US, specifically like in healthcare and housing. But yeah, that's for another lecture. So I'll hand it off to Cheyenne.
Okay, so I'm going to segue into women's rights. These do have a couple little overlaps in different situations. And just as the first wave of the feminist movement was influenced and organized by activists involved in the abolition movement, and the second wave was influenced by the civil rights and anti-war demonstrations, the current feminist marches in the United States have also been influenced by broader global and national movements that have preceded them. The Million Women March is a not very commonly known event. It was organized in Philadelphia in 1997, and it called all women of African descent to come together to address the economic deterioration of their communities, the importance of nurturing young children in a positive environment, finding collective voice in politics and the civil rights movement, and strengthening their family values. This event is still held on a smaller scale, mainly by Facebook organizers. And you can still kind of find those today. And it still takes place in Washington. So the 2017 Women's March movement was kind of started after several of Trump's statements were considered by few as anti-women or otherwise offensive to women. They now happen annually to advocate legislation and policies regarding human rights and other issues, and they've expanded to a lot of different issues, including immigration reform, healthcare reform, disability justice, reproductive rights, the environment, LGBTQ rights, racial inequality, freedom of religion, and workers' rights and tolerance. According to their organizers, the goal was to send a bold message to the new administration on the first day of office and the world that women's rights are human rights. So the main protest initially happened in Washington, D.C., following the inauguration, with many other marches taking place worldwide. The Washington March was streamed live on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, and the Washington March also drew over 470,000 people, with 3.5 million people participating worldwide. So initially how this started was a woman in Hawaii created a Facebook event and invited friends to march on Washington in protest. Similar Facebook pages were subsequently created and quickly led to thousands of women signing up for the event. The organizers then united their efforts and consolidated their pages, beginning the official Women's March on Washington. And this still takes place yearly, but I don't think it happened this year because of COVID. The March for Life is kind of a counter movement to the decision of Roe v. Wade. It's an annual rally and march protesting both the practice and legality of abortion, and it's held in Washington, D.C. And it's always held on the anniversary of Roe v. Wade decision. This march stated that their mission is to end abortion by uniting, educating, and mobilizing pro-life people in the march in the public square. Advocates for overturning Roe v. Wade specifically support this group, and it's organized by the March for Life Education and Defense Fund. So to kind of move into the Black Lives Matter movement in the current historical context, we'll reference a couple of things that kind of worked off of the Black Panther Party. So the Black Lives Matter movement was a response to the institutional and systemic racism that is ingrained in many American institutions, particularly the criminal legal system. And many people believe that because a Black president was elected, we now live in a post-racial United States, which was and is not the case. Black Lives Matter is often critiqued for a leaderless or decentralized aspect of organizing. This is purposeful and a direct response to the deaths and arrests of key Black civil rights leaders and organizers, but it's also a response to the lack of representational leadership within the party when initially women and queer people were routinely left out of organizing, and Black Lives Matter wanted to address this. It's also strategic about social media use and often uses hashtag activism to reach thousands of people with their messages and organizing principles. In May 2020, the hashtag was used nearly 3.7 million times on Twitter per day. And so we'll take a quick poll and you can just send it into the chat, but do you think that social media is an effective tool for political movements? It looks like it's overwhelmingly yes. To a certain extent. Okay. So I'm just going to kind of lead up to this video. It's a 5-minute video. It's done by Politico, and it's basically just a interview of a couple historians, and they discuss some historical comparisons to 1968, why various groups are now supporting the movement, the law and order rhetoric that is presented, and then what implications that might have.
We're going to take attendance before the video. So
Okay.
Attendance is live, folks.
A passionate movement for justice is finding itself swept under the feet of rampaging and destructive mobs.
Just going out and destroying cities is not an answer.
Police have been trying to stop the looting.
I am the descendant of looted people from Africa. We built a nation on looted land from the native people here. We are looting the natural resources of countries around the world to this day.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Ralph. I'm deputy editor of Politico magazine, and I love talking about history, politics, and culture. Our new series, The Backstory, will dig deeper to give you more context about some of the biggest news stories of the day. Many consider 1968 one of the most turbulent, traumatic years in modern US history. In April, civil rights icon Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, roiling the nation and setting off protests and looting and rioting in cities across the country. This was all happening against the backdrop of the Vietnam War, which by mid-year was killing 45 US soldiers a day. Many are comparing this to today. We're seeing our cities roiled by anti-racist demonstrations against the backdrop of a global pandemic that's killed more than 100,000 Americans. I talked to two historians to tell us a little bit more about whether they think history is repeating itself. Hi, Michael.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. Can you see me?
I can, yes.
Good. Hi. Do you see similarities to 1968? How similar do you think the 2 years are, and what are the big meaningful differences?
So I don't think they're similar at all, and I might be in the minority on this. In 1968, you had a crime context that made the law and order narrative very appealing for Blacks and whites. But after 2 decades of dramatic decreases in the crime rate, that context is not there. And so I think it has allowed a new, robust, and radical even discourse around police reform that would not have been available in 1968.
My activist career started with the March on Washington and all the organizing. And it took them months to pull together. And just think of what happened with George Floyd, where within days, a larger set of demonstrations than the March on Washington were organized mostly by young people.
you see a lot of different kinds of people who are now out there taking that risk and giving their time. New polls show that a majority of Americans approve of the message behind the protests. What does that signify to you?
It's not that we're in this post-racial society. If anything, we're in a society where people are extremely conscious of racial and cultural divisions, but they don't see those as necessarily barriers.
Let's talk about the white community and white elites. Do you see them changing their stance as well? Because I know, this is all in the context of President Trump really trying to reinvent Nixon's law and order rhetoric for his era. And this is one of the reasons, you're mentioning one of the reasons why it potentially could not work for his benefit. But I'm curious, do you see law and order becoming a more polarized race issue right now?
If anything, it will become a partisan issue. I was surprised to see Mitt Romney marching and yelling Black Lives Matter, and more white political elites in the Democratic Party are calling for dramatic police reform, including defunding the police. And that's dramatically different also from the 1960s, where you had in the Democratic Party white ethnics who were in charge of police departments at the time, who feared police reform, saw it as an attack on their own power and their own liberty.
The Kerner Commission found that this civil unrest was really brought on by very clear incidents of police brutality. And yet, here we are again, decades later. I'm wondering what didn't happen then that needs to happen now?
I think in the mid-60s, with when Johnson launched the War on Poverty and the Great Society programs, that was one direction. When Nixon came in and with Spiro Agnew and Southern Strategy, that was another direction. Those were choices.
The lack of documentation allowed white political elites on the right in particular to race bait, to use coded language, to explain away the police brutality. It's hard to explain away police brutality when you're watching someone's knee on someone's neck for about 8 minutes. To see someone do that to another human being, I think that does focus you. I think that does change you. I think that does shake your spirit in profound ways.
Do you think that there's cause for optimism right now?
I feel optimistic in the sense that one of the advantages of our century is that we can communicate in ways that were not possible before. Technology, though, is neutral. It can be used and make the world less equal, less just, but it can also contribute to a yearning for freedom that can't be stopped.
Okay, and we're gonna kind of wrap up a little bit and re-summarize some of the things that they mentioned in this video, but some of the names listed were specific people that were garnered around after instances of police brutality and were often used in campaigns to address systemic racism, particularly in the criminal justice system. So a couple examples of these would be Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia, the police shootings of Breonna Taylor in Kentucky, which subsequently led to the Say Her Name hashtag, which had been utilized to bring attention also to the disproportionate level of violence that Black trans women and Black queer women face. Data from the Williams Institute at the UCLA shows that LGBTQ Americans are more than twice as likely to be killed in the United States, but when you look specifically at Black trans women, their risk of being murdered is more than 7 times higher than the average American. Protests and online activism in support of Christian Cooper, the Central Park bird watcher who was racially profiled by a white woman, the police shooting of Tony McDade, a Black trans woman, the murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, police shooting of Jacob Black in Wisconsin. And so essentially these kind of lead up to this movement that subsequently took place over the summer that we saw huge groups coming out for. In 2020, as a result of police shooting of Jacob Blake on August 26th, professional athletes refused to play in their scheduled sporting events, beginning with the Milwaukee Bucks of the NBA. Also, a lot of celebrities have gotten directly involved in the organization because of the decentralized nature of BLM. The public support for Black Lives Matter has largely been split by racial group. However, this year, Black Lives Matter has surged in public support in polls. In June 2020, Pew Research Center found that the majority of Americans across all racial and ethnic groups have expressed support for Black Lives Matter. Opal Tometi, one of the co-founders of the movement, theorizes that the increase in support was a result of the economic anxiety and contempt for the American government handling COVID-19 pandemic. These widespread protests organized by Black Lives Matter have led to some crediting the organization as starting the early 21st civil rights movement and possibly the largest movement in US history. And an estimated 15 million to 26 million people participated, though not are all members of the organization, in the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests in the United States, making it one of the largest movements in US history. As a result, over 450 protests took place all over the country. On June 7th, the wake of global George Floyd protests and Black Lives Matter called to defund the police. The Minneapolis City Council voted to disband the police department and to shift funding to social programs in communities of color. In addition to this, the Minneapolis Public Schools, the University of Minnesota, and Minneapolis Parks and Recreation cut ties with the Minneapolis Police Department. The budget for the police department here in Norman was reduced by $800,065. These funds will instead be used for community outreach programs or for setting up an internal auditing system to monitor police department budgetary issues like abusive overtime. Other cities around the country are also voting on similar issues, like diverting funds for their police departments and instead investing those funds in building communities of color, such as throughout social programs and community organizing. So that is all we have today, and we will yield our time unless there are any questions.
Yeah, does anyone have any questions?
I had a question.
Sure.
Just to Melody, didn't the Oklahoma Supreme Court say the Norman budget cuts were illegal? I don't know. I thought I remember something, but I'm not quite sure on that.
There was a discussion about the procedure that in the meeting because it wasn't in the minute.
Oh, okay.
So, and again, you know, as Will points out, they weren't actually defunded. They were just denied a budget increase. And so it back in front of them with proper procedure for that to happen.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
All right. So I want to say, first of all, thank you to Corinne. Thank you to Cheyenne. Everybody give them a hand. You guys can tap, you know, there you go. Cindy is. Samuel is. Samuel. All right. Okay. Great presentation, guys. I really appreciated it. And I think that you added a lot more dimension and kind of brought us to where we are now. Whereas I was talking a lot more political history, you know, so, which is important, I think, you know, but I think it's the way that we're tied in today and what's going on right now. That was perfect. It was a great lecture. I really appreciate it. I think I told you guys this early in the semester, but all of your fellows will give a lecture at some point. There'll be another couple guest lectures other than me. I think you need to hear voices other than mine here and then, now and then, once in a while. But I need to remind you, very important, read the email I sent you about your exam, okay? There has been a critical change to that. It is not open at 6 p.m. It is open at 6 a.m. on Thursday. In Canvas, it says it is due by midnight on Thursday. It is. It's due then. However, it's open until Friday at midnight, and there will be absolutely no penalty for doing it on Friday. Okay. So I think that is no labs on Friday. That's important. I think there's some discrepancy with the Cengage lecture, or Cengage due dates. So I'm going to check that and make sure it's okay. I know in Canvas that the dates they say that they're due are incorrect. They haven't been changed since the storm. But I gave you guys some extra time last Monday because some of you mistakenly thought it was due at midnight because it was talking about the next chapter. So, yeah. So I think that there's some problems there that I will fix. In the meantime, prepare those prompts with a really quick, outline like Eric just did in 1 minute before class. I mean, prepare them with a quick outline. And then if you want to fill in some stuff while you're studying. But really, I have only given full prompts like this for the last couple of years. Before then, people were given direction to study the questions that we had from lecture, and they came into class and wrote 2 essays in 15 minutes each, and they were able to do it. So I know you guys can do it. All right. Intro with thesis, body, conclusion. All right. Okay. That's it. So until next time, Boomer.
Sooner.
So I had second vaccine yesterday.
I got my first one yesterday.
I am practically immune to everyone now.
No masks, no masks.
Well, I'm not going to go that far, but I may still be a carrier. Who knows? Who knows? But
right.
Samantha, I'll get your attendance. I have a question, Melody. I didn't get an email about changes to the due dates on the test. And I have several students who said they did not get an email either.
I haven't sent an email about the 6 a.m. that announcement in class. Basically, I got something from the College of Arts and Sciences yesterday at 4:49 p.m. That said that a student had reached out to their advisor in complaint, and so that I had to make it due by Thursday night. So I said, okay, I will, but I didn't want to punish all the other students who were planning on doing it on Friday.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, that works. I was like, I didn't see an email, so I was like, want to make sure on that. So
sorry.
Could there be